Not me. Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. Luke Thomas hates the intro. We've got a special treat. Old school MMA tete-a-tete. Luke Thomas guzzling that Diet Coke.
Diet Dr. Pepper. Get it
Diet
right.
Dr. Pepper, even better. An off-brand diet soda.
Delicious.
Awesome. How you doing, Luke?
Good. A little tired. If you see me have a hat on like this, it means I haven't showered yet today.
I see. Well,
Let's see my hair.
I'm a basement-dwelling blogger, but I'm ready for action every day. Shower, no shower, it's always a hat because of sun's skin cancer and such like, not because of vanity. It's a health issue. But we are here to solve all of the UFC's problems, Luke.
That's what we're known for, consultants for the super brand.
Yeah, Dana's been bugging me. He's been, asking for input, and I brought one of his favorite thinkers in, to help put the case. But here's the deal. The UFC is, admittedly, at the very least, in a transitional phase. They're like a man on a trapeze. They're swinging away from pay-per-view. It's pretty clear, the writing's on the wall, and it's been on the wall for a while, that pay-per-view has a limited future. Not just because of technology. It's so easy to steal a pay-per-view stream these days. Very hard to keep your shit locked down if that's your business model. But also because they've got the opportunity with the Fox Sports deal and the Globo deal in Brazil, which the latest reports are saying that is a significant chunk of change to the bottom line, and explains some of these cards like we're seeing tomorrow night, the Vitor Belfort, Dan Henderson card. They kind of make no sense if the intended market was an American audience. Now that we know that Globo is paying real money in the double-digit millions reportedly for the TV rights, that makes a lot more sense. So they're making two swings at once. They're moving from the pay-per-view model to a TV rights model, which is the way the NFL is funded. That's how the NBA is funded. That's how most your major European soccer leagues are funded. So that's the big time, and that's a great goal. They're also trying to take the sport, not just the sport, but their company, their promotion, global. They've established a solid beachhead in Brazil. They're working on expanding their European presence. They're talking about putting on a number of events in Europe and regional events they won't even market in the U.S. They're trying to expand in Asia. We got UFC Singapore coming up. So a lot of worthy goals, but it's always difficult to get from A to B. And the tough thing is FS1, Fox Sports 1, the ratings are terrible. The UFC is carrying the network, but they're already at like 50%, about half what they were getting, the exposure they were getting on Spike TV. And I think we're seeing it eroding in pay-per-view
or FX.
already. All right, you can talk.
Well, I was going to say FX, too. They got good ratings on FX for a while, too.
Yeah, they got good ratings on FX, but then they had to leave the FX network. And the upside is FX didn't want UFC. FX didn't need UFC. FX is a hit channel. It's got its own management team that's been very successful with Louis C.K., and I don't even know what other crap they're running, but I'm told it's getting buku ratings. They didn't like having reality TV on their channel. They didn't care for having sports on their channel. However, FS1 loves having the UFC on their channel. The UFC is the only draw they've got. Now, they've got rights. They've got other sports that are going to be coming in the next couple of years. That channel's going to get stronger. This is a long-term play by a very powerful and wealthy corporation that's thinking long-term. But in the short term, it's a serious hit to the UFC's bottom line if those pay-per-view numbers keep eroding like this. That's your cue to talk, Luke.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what to say, though. Like, didn't we all both agree, though, that they're transitioning to a rights-based model?
That they are, but in the short term, they've got, their budget this year, they're making buku money on pay-per-view. They haven't on track. If the numbers came through like expected, they were on track to have maybe their best year ever on pay-per-view. Now, the Fertitta brothers don't like to turn up short on cash. If they're budgeting for X millions.
Better than 2009?
That's what people are talking. That's what Meltzer's talking. Not in per event average, but overall, because there's more events.
Aggregately, yeah.
Just in terms of final revenue, the total, the net total. The events themselves are not selling as much, but there's more events if the average is up. But when Dana White's talking about UFC 168 being the biggest event ever, bigger than UFC 100, it's just not happening. Am I right?
No, it's not. Man, UFC 100, like the more you go back, it's like what a moment that was, Not just with like the sport peaking, and then it was part of the Lesnar era, and a card that, dude, like, has there been a card as stacked as that one since then? At least main card heavy. Not that I can. 166, for example, was like a great card in totality. But I mean, it was just UFC 100 was a really really special event, and I said this on the MMA Beat if folks didn't realize it, and I mean this, dude. I don't know that we'd have careers were it not for Brock Lesnar. It's the truth, man. Like, do you remember when the first night after that, I said this on the Beat, like, do you remember after Lesnar Mir, the first one, we looked at Site Meter the next day, and we couldn't believe our eyes. The traffic was like, but Bloody Elbow was, incrementally growing, but it was after Lesnar came, it just went whoosh, it was.
It was the difference from a geometric progression to an exponential progression. It was
crazy. Anyway, sort of sidetracked, but no, I think 168 will do fine. I don't know about 167. St. Pierre is always good for what, at least minimum, bare bones, 600,000. I don't know how many more it's going to get than that. I'm not saying it'll do poorly. I just don't have a good read on it. And then this weekend, I don't really know what this event's going to do either. I frankly think it doesn't matter. What's kind of funny to me is like I feel like this Fox deal. Dana White said like they knew about all of this Fox Sports 1 plans and how they'd be positioned on it and everything, and they signed a 7-year deal. And part of me wonders if they signed the deal knowing that they were going to have to eat a little bit of shit with, hey, we're going to put you on a new channel. We need you to build it. Obviously the ratings are not going to be great. I mean, they've had a couple of events where they've been pretty good, but it's a new freaking channel. The ratings are not going to be what they are for an established presence like FX. And part of me wonders if they knew if we do Fox a solid, if we go in there and we say, okay, we're going to take 500,000 or less for the Ultimate Fighter and whatnot, but we'll get things like, UFC Tonight on Fox Sports 1. We'll get consistent presence on the news programs. We'll make it part of the larger sporting diet, right, which has really been a key goal of theirs. And, it's turned out that, dude, those UFC events do better than college football games, I think almost exclusively. Not entirely, but like they'll put good football games on there, and UFC will still beat them out. So part of me wonders if they were just like, let's do it. Let's do them a solid. It'll work with our portfolio of expanding into UK, or at least reinvigorating it anyway, and other parts you mentioned, in Singapore and so forth. And by the time the next deal comes around, maybe after the first 7-year deal is up, then they can pivot to a much more lucrative rights-based contract. Even with the next deal, I don't think they'll abandon pay-per-view. But part of me wonders if this deal was structured around, okay, at the end of 7, if we go in there and we are a building block for FS1 and we're a building block for FS2, and of course getting more in return in terms of the way the sport is included in part of a larger conversation about sports, then we can really sort of hammer them for a lot of money in that second 7-year or whatever the next deal may wind up being. I mean, I don't know that that's the case, but I have to wonder because they're doing 13 pay-per-views next year, a total of 35 events. But now they're doing almost twice as many free events as they are pay-per-view events. And what you didn't mention was apparently the news that I got, in fact, I think you shared it with me, was that Globo deal, the amount of money they're getting for it now makes, in terms of revenue generation, Brazil a bigger market than Canada. That's crazy. That's crazy. I mean, they got hot that fast. Now, they're a long ways away from being as hot as they are or as big as the market is for them in the United States. That's still pretty clearly number one. But for that polarity to shift from Canada, like, it's crazy. Did you see the Fighting for Our Generation documentary?
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was as amazing as everyone else thought it was, but I thought it was good. But Jeff Wackenheim from Sports Illustrated in it was like, oh man, the fans in Canada. I mean, that's the number 2 spot. It's not even the number 2 spot anymore. It's not even the number 2 spot. Brazil is clearly the number 2, both from an activity standpoint and now clearly, without any argument, from revenue generation. So, I don't know what the plans for 2014. I would bet, though, that they're not going to do 13 pay-per-views in 2015. I would bet they're going to par it down to maybe, even if it's like 1 down or 2 down, that to me is like them beginning to hoist the flag of, we're moving to this. And also, like, someone else made a point. Pardon me. I had the flu for the first time in like 15 years. Dude, the flu is no joke.
No, it'll kill you. It'll kill you.
Get your flu shots. Anyway, there's something like unseemly about pay-per-view. Now, like with Mayweather or somebody like that, where it's these really rare moments of cultural confluence where Paris Hilton will sit next to, Jim Nance will sit next to Puff Daddy, will sit next to Donald Trump, and everybody's sort of there to watch this grand sporting event under the guy who's the most prominent figure in combat sports. Pay-per-view still seems like a doable thing there. But day in, day out, it's kind of tawdry. You know, the only thing left on pay-per-view is UFC, wrestling, professional
and
wrestling,
porn.
not the stuff I like, and then boxing.
And mad porn. I mean, every time I order a UFC pay-per-view, when I go back, Sunday afternoon and turn the TV on again, the pay-per-view has switched to like Randy Milfs or, something like that. It's like, it's always embarrassing. Whatever they're showing on that pay-per-view channel the next day, it's always something sleazy and gross. It's
right, or like these one-offs like bare knuckle boxing or whatever the hell. If part of UFC moving to Fox and being a partner with them is not merely that they get included in the larger sporting conversation, but that they begin to take on the architecture of other sports in a way that sports fans find accessible. I mean, yes, obviously the most important criteria is that, as we all know, as people cut their cable, sports becomes DVR-proof. Clearly, for a developing channel like Fox Sports 1, UFC is a very important property for them. But beyond that, it's an appearance thing. Like, you got stuff behind a paywall where you're next to professional. I mean, people still associate the fight game with pay-per-view, and I think that's fine for now. But it's a dead model in 10 years at a minimum. And I don't know, like legitimate sports don't do that. And about what I mean by legitimate, I'm just saying football.
the big time.
They don't do that. They don't do that. And I really think that UFC wants to say we have all the pieces in place like they do with some differentiation down the way. Anyway, so I've rambled a little bit, but I just feel like they've got some challenges because you see these ratings for Fox Sports 2 did 122K and then Lupe was 93K, and I still say this they still beat Bellator in traffic. Did they beat Bellator on Bloody Elbow?
Oh yeah, the Bellator 106 hardly gave us a bump.
We got a little bit of a bump from it, but the problem is I looked at our traffic and it declined.
The bump we got was from streaming the prelims.
Yes, we got the prelims.
That was the
we
peak.
Actually had a spike up to 9:30. And then it declined right until the main event, and then it spiked at the main event, and then declined thereafter. So, but anyway, that's sort of my take about what's going on. I don't know how this Asian stuff's going to work. And MMA Logic was I think it was in Bloody Elbow or Mania was saying that they're gearing up to do 75 events a year. I mean, I can't even conceive of what that would mean, but I guess it's a separate question.
Yeah, well, I mean that's one of the things we're going to move to, but one of the two problems they've got is the weakening, the eroding cable package, like the FS1 being weak, that undercuts a whole key leg. Like their model is based on the old WWE model, which was, the old classic days, TBS, sell the fights on TBS, get fans to buy the WrestleMania on pay-per-view. The UFC followed that plan to perfection with Spike TV for half a decade, and has successfully done it on Fox with FX for a couple of years. Now they're moving to FS1, and suddenly their pay-per-view numbers are down. I mean, there were reasons why the John Jones Gustafson event UFC 165 was a little bit low. People were surprised, though, about the numbers for the Cain Velasquez Jr. Dos Santos fight. Some of that may be that Cain and Jr. are not connecting with fans. There's certainly no Brock Lesnar, Frank Mir, but some of it may be that their promotional platform is just eroding. When fewer people see your commercials, and that's what primetime is, that's what Countdown is, those are commercials for pay-per-views. Spike used to deliver 1 million-something eyeballs to those every week, 2 million eyeballs sometimes, just to the promotional, just to the shoulder programming. FS1 is not even coming close. FS2 is dismal. I mean, when you put a show on FS2 and Orrin Rebney can come back at you with, yeah, we got 10 times as many viewers on our last show as you did on your last show, that's weak. And Dana does not like that. So, however, but like you're saying, and MMA Logic is pointing out, they're playing a bigger game and they're expanding into multiple territories and they're doing multiple things at once. But this comes to the second problem. They are not making stars like they used to. John Jones is not rising like GSP did. GSP never really got the kind of buy-in that Chuck Liddell had. I mean, once upon a time you had the Chuck Liddells, the Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture, Matt Hughes. They created this roster of stars. Rampage Jackson participated in that. And then there was a second wave when Brock Lesnar came in from the WWE. GSP grew up organically through the UFC. And since then, they really haven't produced any stars. And I've gone on and on about this at length. It's because they've got kind of the Bellator syndrome where they're promoting every fight the same way. It's guys fighting. It's face punching. It's not You know, they're not building names, with the exception of the occasional Conor McGregor or Ronda Rousey that they latch onto and start really pushing. For the most part, these guys are just thrown out there, and if they succeed, they succeed. If they don't, they don't. And you've got guys, you know, fighters like Rustam Kabalov the other night against George Masvidal. To me, that was a big-time fight between a proven veteran and a really hot up-and-coming talent, and it's shunted onto this event that almost nobody saw. You know what? A few 100,000 people are going to see that event. Saw that event. Nobody knows who they were. You got somebody like Alexander Gustafsson, who's been laboring away in Europe on Fuel TV. When he finally gets a title shot, it turns out, lo and behold, he's the toughest challenge John Jones has ever had. But he wasn't built up at all. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody expected anything from him. Maybe the case would have been the same if his earlier fights had been on pay-per-view or Fox, because he frankly wasn't all that impressive in his previous fights. It was a surprise even if people are watching closely what a challenge he gave John Jones. But nonetheless, if people had seen him fight, there would have been more interest in that fight and more people buying the pay-per-view.
So what are you proposing as a solution?
Well, there's two things I want to throw out, and both of these are kind of wild hairs, but I think I just want to start the discussion, get people fantasizing, get people like Joe Silva and Sean Selby and Dana White and Bjorn Rebney and Ray Siffo, people who actually do something about this. Think about new ways to promote MMA. And so you mentioned MMA Logic. MMA Logic is kind of a long-time commenter on Bloody Elbow, a mystery man. Nobody knows who he actually is. At one point, he sort of insinuated he had some sort of consulting capacity with Zuffa, but he hasn't made those claims in a few years. It might be that he had that relationship but no longer does. But regardless, he's a very smart dude. He was wildly wrong about his estimates for the numbers they would do on Fox, but
they're going to do $3 million on. Was it Dana White who said they were going to do?
That was Dana White that said that the Ultimate Fighter was going to be getting 3 million viewers a week. And that was just, you know, huffing the fumes. And I mean, the thing is, it wasn't an entirely illogical thing. It was just a refusal to acknowledge that the Ultimate Fighter and reality TV are not as hot as they were in 2005, and that they weren't a good fit for FX. But anyway, Logic has this proposal. He calls it the UFC Lightweight Championship Series. And he's saying if you took one division as an experiment and did 3 events a year, where the entire card was lightweight fights. Like you'd have a title fight. Like, for example, you'd have Pettis versus Josh Thompson in the main event. Co-main, TJ Grant versus Rafael Dos Anjos. Third fight, Gilbert Melendez versus Rustam Kabalov. Or Khabib Nurmagomedov. I'm never going to be able to say that name. Rustam Kabalov versus Edson Barbosa. Diego Sanchez versus Benson Henderson. Jim Miller versus Donald Cerrone. With the implication being that the other guys on that card, if they win, and they win spectacularly, they're going to be fighting in the next title fight. So if you tune in for that lightweight title fight, your plate is set for the rest of the year. You know who the contenders are. And that way they can talk it up. Anybody who saw the last title fight will be ready for the next 2 or 3 title fights because they will have seen these guys perform well on the undercard. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's. But wouldn't that require? Correct me if I'm wrong. Wouldn't that require a more bloated roster?
How so?
To be able to devote chunks of a roster at a time like that.
I don't know that it would have to. I mean, those guys are fighting 2 to 3 times a year anyway. It's just you shuffle them all onto the same card. Now, some of the scheduling things are going to be hard because some of those guys are wildly off schedule with each other right now, where they're fighting 3 or 4 months apart, and it's harder than you think to adjust those things and get everybody on the same schedule. But I don't think it would necessarily.
That's what I mean. Listen, it's hard to make any kind of comparisons between UFC and Bellator. I mean, everyone wants to because Bellator is the next closest thing, but we got to acknowledge no one. Well, I won't say no one. Few in MMA media watch more Bellator than me, and I'll be the first to tell you it's a distant second. But that is what Bellator does. Like, they'll have their featherweight final, or even, you know, it's what they did last season. I'm told they're planning to do it next season. Is they'll have, let's say, all right, so Curran's not the champ anymore, but they would have like Curran fight, and then they'd have a couple of featherweight fights or quarterfinals on the same card. So you could be like, okay, these guys are building up to fight that guy at the end, ostensibly. Now it's Strauss, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't really. I don't know how well that works for Bellator, to be honest. Now, again,
I think the difference is that Logic is not proposing a airtight formal tournament structure. which you have to admit kind of handcuffs Bellator when somebody gets hurt.
Yeah, but that's not. But I just think Bellator doesn't have the brand visibility to really. You can't really measure if that's working or not because there's just not a lot of measurement there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that is a model that they follow pretty at least at the beginning of the season when they launch those quarters and they launch those semis. They try to have some kind of continuity there between this is how it starts and this is how it ends. Obviously, though less so for this season. Anyway, I don't know where I'm sort of going with that, but I don't know. I feel like that's an interesting way to go about it, but I don't know. Are we talking in reality here? Are we talking about something that they're really going to adopt, or are we talking about like changes they can make at the margins? You know, you brought up Gustafsson. You know, people were poo-pooing this Manuel fight. Like, why the fuck is he fighting this guy? I think this is the perfect fight. The only downside is it's because it's London. He's going to fight in front of I mean, it might do well at the gate, but it's a lock that's going to be an FS2, right? So it's going to be 150,000 people, give or take, and the reality is, but that's the right fight, right? Like I was saying before, everyone gets so bitter about, well, this is a fucking setup fight for Gustafsson, as it should be, fool. Like the fight everybody wants to see is the second fight with Jones. Manuel, listen, it's the crazy sport. It's not like boxing where this is like a complete setup. The crazy shit happens in the sport. You never know if Manuel wins.
Manuel was a scary dude. He can look at you funny and your kneecap blows out. I mean,
he's got as Rampage Jackson says, he's got the weird juju. But the thing is, this is what you should be doing. You got a guy in Manuel, hometown favorite. Everybody wants to see the Gustafsson fight. You can't sacrifice Cormier because then you're robbing Peter to pay Paul because you need Cormier down for some other fight down the line that's got the headliner for all, UFC goes parasailing 7 or whatever the hell they're going to do. UFC eats at 5 guys 15, whatever. So you get the idea. So they need somebody. They need somebody to headline that card. And so to me, it's like a super winnable fight. If Manuel wins, it's not the end of it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. Gustafsson will likely look good. The only problem is no one's going to really see it, so that's a huge downside. But I just mean, if the UFC wants to keep fights in place and give guys who are heavy favorites, semi-relevant fights where they can look really good in the end, I'm completely okay with that. It's so much promotion. It's engineering, but it's also just a little bit of,
it's sleight of hand, man.
It's complete sleight of hand, and I'm really kind of okay with that. Plus, Manuel's 33.
I mean, look at the whole career of Nick Diaz. Like the same people who bitch about Gustafsson getting a gimme fight are riding Nick Diaz's balls nonstop without acknowledging that the whole reason Nick Diaz is a big star is because he got half a decade's worth of gimme fights out of Strikeforce. I mean, like he had 2 fights with KJ
People loved
Noons.
him for it.
Yeah, because they were great fights. They were hugely entertaining. I mean, beating up a 36-year-old Frank Shamrock, that's not something he would have gotten the opportunity to do in the UFC, but it made for a very entertaining fight. And it built an aura around him. The fight with Paul Daly, you can't say that wasn't a tough fight. I mean, Paul Daly is scary as hell. And he gave Diaz everything Diaz could handle, but these are both guys who would have been bumped out of the UFC round robin by Johnny Hendricks or Mike Pierce or some tedious, Jake Ellenberger, Jake Shields. One of the Jakes would have got him and mugged him and hugged him and laid him down and snuffed those aspirations. And that to me has always been the fundamental contradiction in what the UFC wants to do. They market themselves like pro wrestling and they book their fights like the NCAA. And I think they need to acknowledge, like, look, we're in the spectacle business. I think that the notion that we're going to identify the best fighters and let the best fight the best and the cream will rise to the top, that's never going to work. MMA is not football. This isn't a monumental undertaking of organizing a team of 60-something individuals and coaches into a killing machine. This is one dude getting trained as well as he can. But on any given day, I mean, look at the way the WEC came in and regulated in the UFC lightweight division. Did anybody think that was going to happen before Pettis and Bendo came over and regulated? No. People would have laughed at you if you'd said that was going to happen. And what it points out to me is on any given day, I think anybody in the top 10 could beat anybody else. You never know when GSP is going to come in there with a nearly torn ACL and it's going to pop in the first round. Or he could lose another cousin in a car wreck and get Matt Serrat again. I mean, the things that go on with one individual, there's so many variables. I just think this notion that you're going to prove who the best is through single combat, you're never going to prove who the best is. You're going to prove who the best is on one given day between two individuals, but that doesn't mean that this guy is necessarily the best in the world. So fuck it. Let's just put on a show. Let's get guys, let people know the fighters. You want to hear my idea, or you going to answer that last
No,
round?
I want to hear your idea.
Okay, here's my idea. And this goes back to Pancrase and K1 and the early UFC. Now, those cards all had a lot of guys that were not necessarily, I mean, Pancrase, we look back and we think Boss Root and Ken Shamrock, Funaki, Suzuki. I mean, these were the greats. They had some greats. But they also had, and they had some near greats. They had your Guy Metzgers and your Yuki Kondos and Jason DeLucias. But then they had, your Rushi Yanagasawa, or whatever his name was, Manabu Yamada. They would have these guys that were there year in, year out. And it was cool. Like, you got to see Frank Shamrock roll over these guys. You had like basically, 12, 16 guys on the Pancrase roster at any given time, and they basically just fought each other all through the season. One guy might go 1-4 for the year and then be back. But people didn't really care because they were they were like worried, well, what's Frank Shamrock doing? What's Boss Rutan doing? What's Guy Metzger doing? Same thing with K1. You didn't really worry about that Mike Bernardo had lost some big fights. If you saw him in there, against Andy Hug or Jerome LeBanner, it was like, cool. It's Bernardo and LeBanner. I know those guys. Let's see this fight. I think the thing is, you need fighters that people are familiar with and care about. It doesn't really matter how absolutely great they are. Are they relatively competitive, and are they familiar to the audience? And so what I'm proposing is have a UFC Elite League, just for the pay-per-views and the Fox cards. You have a pool of maybe 16 guys in each division, and that's it for the whole year. These are the 16 guys that are going to be in the top flight UFC, and there'll be a clear marker between the A-League and the B-League UFC events. And for that whole year, if you have guys get injured, maybe you have guys roll in and out, but it'll be a big deal. Like, if a guy gets hurt and can't continue and has to drop out of the league for the year, then it's a big deal when somebody gets the call up. And it's because they've been kicking ass at the next level down. And then at the end of the year, you cut maybe 6 of them, 6 out of the 16. And that gives every fight a lot of meaning, but it also gives the fans time to digest and to get to know each fighter. And also, it gets people a chance to see, round robin, to me, is one of the most awesome things about MMA. One of my favorite eras in the UFC was the Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, Vitor Belfort, Tito Ortiz era. You saw those guys fight each other in every possible permutation, and it was awesome. I don't care that Vitor lost to every one of them. I was glad to see him get to fight all of those 3 guys. I was glad to see, it established exactly who was where in the hierarchy. You had, Randy win one from Chuck, but Chuck ultimately proved he was the top man in that pack. And frankly, I'm still bitter that Babalu Sobral only fought Chuck. I would like to have seen Babalu versus Randy, Babalu versus Vitor, Babalu versus Tito. You get where I'm going? It's that round robin. These guys, let's see how they do against each other in every possible combination, not just have a guy in the UFC and be like, oh, he couldn't get past Jake Ellenberger and Johnny Hendricks. Fuck him. He's cut. To me, that's just a crazy standard.
Well, wouldn't you run into the problem where if a guy loses to the same guy twice, Liddell beat Babalu twice, this model only holds up for a year or 2?
Well, that's when you bring in a new pack of 6 guys, new blood every time. I mean, if you've got...
What are you going to do? You're going to bring in the Luke Barnatts of the world? Oh, this is the fresh blood we brought into the middle.
No, I mean, you'd still have your hot up-and-comers. You'd still have Kabalov and Nurmagomedov making noise and earning their way, and then there'd be a lot of talk. Fans could vote on who they want to see make it into the big league the next year. Fans could argue about who should get cut and who shouldn't, and which matchups do you want to make. I mean, I can see if you got 4 or 5 of those guys just hang around in the top, for several years, you could end up with sometimes you're going to see a guy fighting a guy that's already beaten him 2 or 3 times. But I think you could avoid that with clever matchmaking. I don't think that's that big of a problem. I mean, fundamentally, what I want to see is fighters that fans know. And then you can invest your reality show time on those guys in their camps.
How much of this are we just wrong about? Here's what I mean.
Oh, probably 99%.
Yeah, I don't really mean this particular architecture, which is fairly radical, you have to admit, in its proposal. listen, we're going to put on a card in the middle of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. You, average UFC fan, or maybe not even that, above average, pretty hardcore, not too hardcore, but like UFC a lot. You're going to know 3 of these dudes. But hey, it's a Wednesday. It's right after work. It's a main card. It's free on Fox Sports 1. Fuck it. You just like watching good fights. The ratings came out. They weren't great, but by like all estimations, they're not bad either.
Have you heard numbers yet?
Yeah, I think they did like about 650K.
That's solid.
I mean, for a fucking fight for the Troops card where Tim Kennedy and Rafael Natal or Rafael
on FS1. I mean, however, if they'd posted those numbers on Spike a couple years ago, that would have been a disaster.
All right, that's true. But, I mean, we're in a new paradigm. Like, how much of it is Dana White right? Like, yes, they might have some trouble. For example, those primetime shows, they don't do great numbers. They do like 80,000 on Fox Sports 1. Like, the shoulder programming really doesn't resonate. It's the live event experience. So how much of that, and I think when they do those live events lead-ins to Ultimate Fighter, it bumps up Ultimate Fighter too. Like, how much of it is Dana White right, being like, listen, we're gonna have a huge ass roster, and we're gonna put on some dudes you've definitely never heard of. Fights may be good, maybe not. Fingers crossed. In this case, they were pretty good. And listen, we can still do big numbers on pay-per-view. So, f off. Like, how right is he about that? And our obsession with stars fighting stars is just over-dramatized nonsense.
Well, here's the deal. When I started bitching about them watering down their pay-per-view cards after, like, UFC 108, I think was the first time I really raised hell. When they had that New Year's card with Rashad Evans and Thiago Silva in a 3-round main event, and I was saying, hey, you're watering down your product. I was right about that shit. I've been vindicated over time that the numbers fell because they kept putting up shitty pay-per-view headliners.
Yeah, but Jose, time out. But didn't you just say they're doing more pay-per-view money now than ever, or at least
in the aggregate? But their average per event, has fallen, and what you're seeing and now in the collapse of the TV ratings is that a lot of casual fans have walked away from the UFC. There's no denying that they're not as big as they were in 2009. I mean, nobody can claim, oh, they're picking up new fans every day. Tap-out shirts are just flying out the wall.
Domestically.
And like we said at the beginning, they are playing, it's like Barack Obama and his infamous seven-dimensional chess or whatever the bullshit is supposed to be about what a genius that a-hole is. But I'm going full Jacob Volkman on the president here. But, so they're playing it at a different level than we can. And somebody like Joe Silva's got to think a lot more factors than we can. But nonetheless, the product is not as hot as it was. And I think to some extent that's inevitable. They were red hot from 2005 to 2009, maybe into 2010. And then the sort of fans they attracted were inevitably going to turn off other people. I mean, you can only have so many roided out meatheads running around in Affliction and tap-out shirts, rocking it up at Hooters before everybody else in the country goes, who are these assholes and when are they going away? And, there's sort of it's inevitable they were going to attract a fan base that is going to put some other people off. However, I think the erosion has been bigger and faster than it had to be. And when you look at numbers like 165 and 166, where they're off by, 100,000 pay-per-view buys from where everybody predicted. I mean, nobody was predicting the kind of numbers Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos 3 did. Am I wrong?
No, that's true.
I mean, and then these numbers for Ultimate Fighter. I mean, if you told Dana White, when he was doing his press conference speculating the Ultimate Fighter first season on FX was going to get 3 million viewers a week, and told him, no, actually, dude, come 2013, you're going to be happy to be doing 600,000 a week, and in a bad week you'll do less than 500,000. That's fucking murder, man. That show is no longer functioning as a promotional vehicle. I don't know what its function is at this point, but it is not creating stars. You can't
So you think there'll be no bump for Rousey on 168 in terms of buy rate? I mean, obviously Weidman, Silva, that's carrying the show. There's no doubt about it. Okay, fair enough. And Rousey is her own press-generating entity because of who she is. Okay, fair enough. But in terms of value add from the show,
it's been a value detract. I mean, look at Rousey's. I'd love to see some survey data on Rousey's Q number and her positives and negatives. I mean, she's shown herself to be a much less likable person than I think anybody anticipated. Miesha Tate is registering as the breakout star of that show, if anyone is. But the data from social media we're seeing is that Miesha Tate's getting as much buzz and pop as Ronda Rousey is. And frankly, you got a show that's pulling in 400,000 viewers a week, between 450 and 700,000 a week. That's not enough to build a star. That's not enough to get a pop. I mean, it's just not.
How about this though? I mean, so the criticism, and I think a fair one, is that as a promotional vehicle for pay-per-view, it's really not as a fact. I mean, how can you really sell a pay-per-view when you're doing between 400,000 and 600,000? Sometimes more than that. They get into the 7s and 8s, I think, occasionally.
And not only that, and this has been true for a long time. The beauty of the first season of Tough, like they were saying on the Fighting for a Generation special, is that it humanized the fighters. I mean, I think that wave of first generation Tough fighters, Forrest Griffin, Stephan Bonner, Josh Koscheck, Diego Sanchez, Chris Lieben, Kenny Florian, so on and so forth. Even on the second wave, Melvin Guillard and the guys from the second season, guys from the third season, fourth season, fifth season, are still riding because people know these guys. They like these guys. They're familiar with these guys. They know their pluses, their minuses. They've seen their ups and their downs. That has ceased to function for a long time. You had a period when there was always this tension between Spike wanting the entertaining personalities and UFC wanting the good fighters. And it seems like Spike won out because you had these seasons of Junie Brownings, and you had Ultimate Fighter went from producing guys like Forrest Griffin and Rashad Evans, who went on to be champions and went on to become legit stars and top athletes in the sport, to producing guys like Efren Escudero and Ryan Bader. And no offense to those guys, they're great athletes, but they're just not quite great enough. And they didn't have any personality, and they didn't last in the UFC, at least not at a high level. And so what you have is this massive opportunity cost. I mean, what would it cost you to buy 1 million viewers a week for an hour on Spike TV, like they did, or multiple millions on the Kimbo Slice season? The only star they got out of that long term was Roy Nelson. But look at the money they invested in promoting Marcus Jones. Which was not a bad pony to bet on. It looked like that guy could be here's a charismatic guy who's a top flight NFL athlete who's learned some fighting skills. Turns out he didn't have a chin, but when you look at the amount of money that it costs to get that kind of cable exposure for guys who, and most of the time, not only did they not become stars, everybody knew they were never going to become stars. I mean, guys like, I can't even remember the names of the dudes, but like Michael Chiesa and Colton Smith. I mean, clearly these guys are never going to become UFC champions. Frankly, they're never going to be UFC stars, and I think that was clear going in. I mean, it's just no longer serving any promotional function. And had you gotten somebody like, the young lions of the lightweight division on cable TV at that exposure level, that would be worth a lot of money to people. If you got these contenders rising up and nobody's seen them, nobody knows their story. If Johnny Hendricks had had a full season on Spike TV or on FX in front of millions of people, you can't argue that this pay-per-view coming up wouldn't be a lot bigger. I mean, nobody really knows much about Johnny Hendricks other than he's a guy with a beard and a big right hand, or the left hand. He's got one big punch and a beard. And this is a guy who was an infamous asshole in college wrestling. This guy would electrify arenas because he was so hated. I mean, he had great charisma for drawing a crowd as an amateur wrestler, and none of that has come across in the UFC. I mean, this is a guy who could be one of the great heels of his era, and nobody really knows anything about him except he's got one big punch.
Yeah, but let's sort of circle back to your original criticism. Let's not. I'm not sure about the Hendricks thing. That's a separate issue. Again, I think they are having some challenge with the bigger stars. And why is Hendricks even fighting GSP? They've shown all those knockouts and stuff. And, there's Cameron, there's Fitz, whatever. Let's put that aside for just a moment. Your major criticism, and I think it's a fair one, that you can't really sell pay-per-views if your promotional vehicle is doing 500,000 views a week. It's just not possible. And I'm sympathetic to that. But again, let's take that long view. If the long view is, as the UFC expands internationally and grows the portfolio of revenue generation, where pay-per-view is no longer I think they're trying to get to 75-25 international money, and there's really no pay-per-view overseas market. Australia a little bit, maybe some other countries here or there, but not really. It's basically what they got going on in Brazil, rights-based models, their licensing fees. And if they can grow that and grow that and grow that, does it really matter if these things aren't capable of promoting people as a pay-per-view attraction. Because as we know, let's say pay-per-view died tomorrow. What would happen? Well, you'd still have the 4 UFCs on Fox, and if they're during the NFL season, they're going to this proven they're going to do well. Now imagine if those guys are your John Joneses and your St. Pierres and your Cain Velasquez's. Like, holy shit, there's something real possible here. For the Ultimate Fighter, that still beats some of their college football games. 500,000 is not insignificant for Fox Sports 1. Now, long term, what does it mean? But if the sole argument is it's not a catalyst for pay-per-view purchasing, I'm sympathetic to it. But we can't contradict ourselves and say, well, look at the long view. The long view is we're going to grow in Singapore. We're going to grow in Malaysia. We're going to grow in all of East Asia. We're going to grow in South America with this Televisa deal. We're going to grow in parts of Europe. I think that's a tougher nut to crack, but okay. Hotter markets, maybe like South Africa. We're not too worried about that because we're going to move away from that entirely. These are sustainable numbers for the networks that we're on. As they grow, we might as well. I'd be worried about declining numbers generally on TV, but what about that argument?
Well, here's the thing. I think that the same factors that create pay-per-view stars create television stars. And if you can't create pay-per-view stars, I don't think you can create TV stars. Like they are misallocating their promotional resources is the bigger thing. Not necessarily what is the goal of that promotion. Is the goal to sell pay-per-view or is the goal to get TV ratings? They need to be making a generation of young stars. Like remember at the dawn of the Zuffa era or right around the first season of Tough, you'd buy a UFC DVD and you'd see...
I used to buy all of those, by the way. I have all upstairs. I've got everything right up until like 66, 67.
Yeah, and it was fun. It was an event. And it was the first time you got to see the prelims. And you'd see things like, oh, holy shit, did you see this Nick Diaz cat knock out Robbie Lawler? Wow, did you see this Carol Parisian kid throwing fools around? I've never seen judo in the UFC before. I mean, you had all these guys. GSP was coming up like a monster. Remember when he mauled Frank Trigg? I mean, every time you bought a UFC DVD, there were stars on it, stars in the making. And it clicked with people and it registered with people in a way that it just doesn't now. And because you've got like that Kabalov Masvidal fight the other night is buried in this sea of frankly dreck. I mean, you know, some of those fights were okay, some of them were not so okay, but it's just like this wave of, you know, even some of the good fights, like they had the bantamweight fight and the featherweight fight back to back. And honestly, I cannot straighten out Rivera from Bermudez, you know, in my head. Like, who is who? Right now I could not tell you. And I watch every fucking fight, most of them 2 or 3 times. Like, what is the average viewer thinking? Like, oh, it's another little Hispanic dude with a tattoo punching some white guy in the face. Like, how are they supposed to keep this stuff straight? You just got too many guys, too many that don't stand out. And by not drawing clear lines and people are stupid. You got to say, here's what you're going to see. Here's what you saw. You know, now we're watching it, and here's what we saw. You got to give it that coming and going. You know, it's just like rock and roll. The rock critics have to tell everybody who's great. Then you see them. Then they have to tell them this is great. And then then they come back and say that was great. You know, Kanye West is an important artist. You know, blah blah blah. You've got to tell people what am I seeing, what am I gonna be seeing, and what did it mean what I saw. And they're not doing that now. It's just guys fighting. It's just face punching. It's just dudes with the UFC gloves on. And when they do that, it just waters down the whole product, and it makes it almost impossible for somebody like Gustafsson or Kabalov, who have had performances that should have been star-making performances. They're not stars. I mean, that's the dilemma they're in. That they're just. I think they need to draw clear boundaries. I'm excited about the European deal. Have you heard about like what they're talking about with the European deal?
Sure.
Where they're talking about putting on 14 events in Europe next year. And these will essentially be like...
Not next year. Not next year.
I thought it was 2014 that they were talking about.
They're only doing 35 events next year total.
Okay. Well, at one point, the international VP, the guy that's in charge of Africa and Europe, he was talking shit about how we're going to have multiple events in 2014. I think they've talked him.
They are going to have multiple events. I think they want to have a big presence in 2015 and 2016.
Yeah, 2015. But either way, the long-term goal is to basically have a regional European MMA circuit that's all branded UFC that will be lucky to get the occasional guest spot by an Alexander Gustafsson or a Jimmy Manuwa. Most of these guys will be fighting on it are guys that are right now slogging it away in Poland at KSW or whatever that event is called, guys that are fighting in Russia on M1. It's going to be the same sort of, you know, mid-tier guys except they're going to be branded UFC. They're not going to have any North American presence. They're solely going to be selling it to Europeans. And then it's just, to me that's a fairly risky proposition because they're watering down their brand.
Well, I think that we haven't talked about it yet, but like I wanted to quickly, while we still have some time, talk about the roster issue.
Absolutely.
And Goldie was like, "That's almost 400." Yeah, thanks for rounding up, Goldie. Your math skills are truly instrumental to this understanding of this conversation. I think Mike Fagan, I think your favorite on Twitter, was talking about it. They have more people on roster than the NBA. Think about that.
Yeah.
And the NBA payroll, I mean, I could be wrong about this. By all means, correct me if I am, but I think the NBA payroll is something like, I could be wrong about this, but the combined total NBA payroll, something like $2 billion. Think about the combined payroll for UFC. Now, UFC, of course, is not even, it's a much wider league, but it's not, it's a league. And I still think UFC views itself as like a sports franchise, which is a little bit different, But even then, I mean, compare that to the Miami Heat salaries. I don't know what it would be, but of course they don't have 400 guys in the Miami Heat. But even then, probably the Miami Heat make more. I don't know about that. I could be wrong, but whatever the case, you get the idea.
Yeah. Well, the Brooklyn Nets alone have a $100 million payroll for 2012 and 2013.
The Brooklyn Nets?
I didn't even know that Brooklyn Nets fucking existed, but that's what I'm finding here at Hoops World. The Knicks, $89 million. The Lakers, $88 million. Miami Heat, $81 million. All the way down to the lowest, the Atlanta Hawks at $13 million. That's just pathetic, but still, I mean, that is way more than the UFC is paying out to dudes, and rightfully so. The NBA is a big deal,
and they have a huge rights model too. Not like the NFL, but obviously they have a pretty significant deal. But my only point is, and this is something that's crazy to me, like the UFC is moving in a direction where they're becoming the NBA and the NBDL, and I'm not.
And the women's NBA.
Yeah, and to me, it's like listen. We're not again paid consultants here for Zuffa. I'm sure they take my opinion so seriously, but there's something for me I just don't understand about it. I just don't understand what the value add is for UFC. Like people were asking me, like, and I mentioned it before, like, oh, how excited are you to see like a Luke Barnett or like a Sam Cecilia? It's like, I'm not. I mean, maybe one day they develop into something, and then they deserve to be in the UFC on those. I know that they're both already in the UFC, but you know what I'm saying. Like if it was a little bit more strict and regimented about who was in and who was out.
Yeah.
If they made their way up to that kind of thing, I'd be like, okay, sure. Anybody who gets the clearance, or almost anybody gets the clearance is, worth something. But the only thing I can think of, and if I'm wrong, tell me. We've talked about this privately. Like, the only reason I can imagine doing that is one, yes, you need some bodies for these shows, but I don't know why some of these shows are like 7 hours. It's just insane. And I mean, no sports event is like, not even freaking, nothing is 7 hours, continuously. You have like NCAA tournaments where you've got an hour and then a break and then an hour and then a break. Anyway, it's so that competitors can't have them.
That's absolutely it.
If you take up your top, they have the top tier guys, that's the overwhelming majority, and then you've got some mid tier and even in some cases some frankly lower tier guys. There's just a handful in the UFC.
Brian Houston, God bless him, but 4-0 in MMA.
Fulton Smith is 3-3.
Yeah.
Fulton Smith is 3-3, and he's fighting in his second weight class. These are not top tier fighters. They're just not. So help me understand what is the obsession to get a hold of those guys. And then you're cutting Yushin Okami. I don't understand it.
Well, here's what I think they're doing, and this is one of those things where they're doing two things at once that sort of contradict each other. They're trying to flood the market. It's like a poker game. If you've ever played poker, and I haven't, but I've seen it, I've heard about it. When you got poker, you got players of equal skill, say, sitting down at the table. The real factor is who's got the bigger pot, And if you get two poker players of equal skill at a table, and one guy's got a much bigger pot, he's just going to bet hands down on every fucking hand. And that other guy is just going to have to eat it hand after hand after hand. And he's just going to get eroded. When he finally does have a hand, he's not going to have enough money in his pot to do anything with it. And that's what the UFC is doing. They're the guy with all the chips. And they're at the table, and they're just raising the stakes on every hand. Even if they just eat it on some of these hands, they don't care. They're like, we've got the Fox deal, we've got the international connections, we've got the brand recognition, Let's see if you can last this out. And here's the thing. They tried to do this with proxies. They tried to do this with Strikeforce, which the purpose of the Strikeforce deal was basically to block anybody else from getting on Showtime. The purpose of the WEC deal was to block anybody else from getting on NBC Sports. Now, the net outcome of that is that there's no longer a market for B-grade MMA owned by Zuffa. Like, I think right now they would happily brand something, what they're doing on FS2, something different. UFC International or World MMA or something like that. But after what people saw, what happened to the WEC on NBC Sports or Versus Network, and what happened to Strikeforce on Showtime, nobody wants to sell Brand B. That's why you see Viacom fighting so hard for Eddie Alvarez, because they don't want to be perceived as Brand B or the Starter League or the Junior League. That nobody wants to sell, hey, this is the show where you can watch tomorrow's UFC stars. Everybody wants to say, no, this is the show where you can see the best in the world. And the UFC is in a position where they have to water down their brand if they're going to flood the market. And they want to flood the market. They're deathly afraid of competitors for whatever reason. They want to have a complete vertical monopoly on this sport worldwide, which is pretty damn audacious. But I think it comes with some inherent contradictions that make it very hard to do, and at the cost of watering down their brand.
So you think they're publicly acknowledging the roster is bloated, right? I mean, they've said as much. But what does that mean? Does that mean they're going to try and keep it at 4? Is it going to jump to 5? Like, I don't understand.
What MMA Logic is saying, and he has no, for all we know, he has no more insight than we do.
But he has interesting theories. He
has interesting theories. He's always a fun guy to read and to think about what he's saying. He's saying you ain't seen nothing yet. He's saying this is like an Al Jolson show, baby. The first number doesn't tell you nothing. This guy's going to be juggling. He's going to be singing. I mean, you're going to have it all tonight, folks. And that someday soon, you're going to have like 700 guys on the UFC roster. That they're not going to be doing 36 events a year. They're going to be doing 75 events a year. What he was saying was that the prelim card the other night on Wednesday night was so stacked that soon that's going to be your main card. And that the main card tonight is going to be 2 main cards, like that you would split those fights up and have 2 cards out of it, and that they're going to continue to stomp on the product and offer it on so many channels and so many places, and that at a certain point, people aren't going to be expected to be watching the prelim fights. Like, they'll be available online for really crazy hardcores who want to see all the fights, but it's not going to be like today where every site's going to have live results from the UFC prelims. It's just going to be like, maybe one article summing up what happened for those who really care, but they're not going to be pushing the prelims like they do now, and that they're going to be pushing the main cards, still probably have bigger, a lot of fighters on the cards, but you're only going to be worried about 4 or 5 fights per card. And so I don't know if there's any insight to that, but that makes a little bit more sense, that if they're going around the world, they're going to be more events, but fewer of the fights on those events are going to be promoted like they matter.
Part of me feels like it makes sense to diversify their revenue. Part of me also believes them when I think they're right when they say their product is mobile, it's transportable culturally and across international lines. I think all that is true. I don't disagree with any of that, but they seem, again, just from viewing from afar, they seem to have a sense of empire building that is
grandiose.
Grandiose, like, where can't we go? And I'm thinking, shit, all kinds of places, if for no other reason than logistically how you manage all this. Has any sports franchise or any sports organization, FIFA doesn't even have, FIFA has like a loose confederation and control, and it's not the same thing as a UFC. It's a regulatory body in some ways, but no one has a global footprint like that. Is it even really possible to have a global footprint? I mean, I know other companies, let's say in the technology space, can do things like that, but even then, well,
Google's not the biggest search engine in China or Japan, for one. Facebook's not top network in South America.
And also, you can get Apple products anywhere, but Apple's not setting up. We've got one of our main offices in Shanghai, one of our main offices in Sao Paulo, one of our main offices in Montenegro, and one of our main offices in London. They've got some clear centers of power, but then mostly it's just the shipping of consumer goods. I really don't understand. And again, I'm literally saying, I'm not saying it's wrong. I can't process organizationally what it's going to be for them to make that model a reality, sustainable, profitable, and coherent. I mean,
Yeah.
at that point, what it would even mean to be a UFC show? It wouldn't mean nothing, but it would mean fairly little at that point, given the differentiate. It's already differentiating, but still, there's still a sense of the ownership of top talent. I really don't understand it. I mean, I can see if they spend it. I can see, again, I understand expansion. Certainly, they've got the Western Hemisphere on lock at this point. And as they go east, we talked about it. Some of them, Germany would be a tough nut to crack, but it's an important one, largest economy in Europe. South Africa seems to have some promise. East Asia seems to have different parts of it, not Japan so much, but there's some promise there. And China, we'll see what happens. It's a worthy investment. If NBA can grow there, we'll see what happens. Home of martial arts, okay, fair enough. But trying to bring these markets to life, trying to educate these fan bases, trying to find stars, create them, and manage this entire process. And everyone's like, oh, they've got offices in all these places. So what? How do you have global coordination over something that would require global coordination? You would need your top talent at some point, right, fighting each other. And if you manage to develop it from Malaysia, how would you get that? I just don't understand it. At some point, I think you can definitely go international. You can go deeply international, but it seems to me there's got to be limits there.
I think that the real limit is they're trying to do it with a one-size-fits-all model. I mean, it's the UFC brand and it's the Ultimate Fighter reality show as the promotional vehicle. That's what they're pushing in China. That's what they've been pushing in Brazil. That's what they'd love to be pushing in Europe if they could just get a TV deal. And to me, that's just crazy. There's just no way to conquer the world and not acknowledge that people are different in different places. I mean, a decade ago when you had MMA at its peak worldwide, I would still say 2006 was probably MMA's biggest worldwide year ever because the UFC was suddenly popular in the US and Pride was still a monster in Japan. I mean, a monster. Those Pride events from turn of the millennium up through the end of Pride, those are the biggest events MMA has seen worldwide still to this day. I mean, nobody's drawn an audience like Bob Sapp versus various TV comedians or some of the biggest Pride events. And part of the deal was Pride was customized for its market. It was in a ring. They had different rules. No elbows on the ground. It was a less bloody event. You had a 10-minute opening round. You judged the fight as a whole instead of as a parts. And the UFC is dead set on everything's an octagon. Everything's a 10-point must system. Everything's 4-ounce gloves. Everything's elbows on the ground. No knees to a downed opponent. No curb stomps. No soccer kicks. I mean, and I don't know that that's right, that you can do that. I think you've got to let things evolve a little bit more organically. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Clearly they've been way more successful at this than I ever would be, but I just think it's almost insanely ambitious. And then you look at somebody like Dana White, who's an incredible success story as an executive and as a sports frontman. I mean, this guy, I don't know that Harvard Business School is going to be writing case studies about what he's done in the business world, but I think he is well worth plenty of case studies as a media personality and as a business success. He's done some amazing things. In the business world of sports, he's, I think, definitely a Hall of Famer. However, he's struggled with Meniere's disease, or however you say it. Meniere's disease. And you can see, if you've watched Dana White over the years, you could just tell he is not as hands-on as he used to be. Did you watch the vlog for the last vlog he did where he was backstage at UFC 166? And I swear he did not know the names of half the dudes.
He read the names off the card and then he got half the names wrong.
Yeah, I mean, and that says everything. It's like, on the one hand, here's a guy who's a complete control freak who wants to have his finger in every pot, and on the other hand, he doesn't know what the pots are. He doesn't know who's who, what's what. There's too much to keep up with. I mean, anything over 150-something people is more than you can process. I mean, nobody in the NBA is trying to keep up with every single player on every roster. Each GM has their roster that they know intimately and maybe another roster-size list of guys that they'd like to have or that they're watching in college prospects. Nobody is trying to keep track of 500 NBA basketball players, not at an intimate level. And I think that the ambition of it, and then this travel schedule, at one point when he was trying to go to Brazil all the time and be in Vegas, and he was missing events, and it's just he stepped back from that. But I just worry that they're biting off more than they can chew, and when the whole sport is dependent on the health of one company, it's kind of scary.
It is scary. Again, maybe they'll be naturally rebuffed. Like they'll try to go to Russia and it just doesn't work. I mean, they were going to go back to Japan. They haven't been back since. I'm sure they have a plan to go back in 2015 or 2016 at some point. So I can see a case where you can have these hubs: U.S., Canada, Brazil. Let's say Singapore, maybe some other ones, and you can do intermittent shows, one every couple of years in Moscow, one every 6 months, or 9 to 10 months in, I don't know, Milan or something like that. I can conceive of something like that, but I just don't understand how you can. I struggle to think of like any other company, particularly in the sports world, that. I mean, am I wrong? Like, I mean, there's nothing that is even like, everyone's like, well, the NFL doesn't go to Europe. It's like, do they need to?
I think the closest analog would be, Hollywood studios, but they don't make whole separate lines of movies for different markets. They modify their American product so it'll do well in China or do as well as possible in China, but they just make one movie and ship it all around the world. They're not dealing with a different movie for every market, which the UFC is a live event-based model, so that they want to do everything. And I really worry when I hear them talking about putting on basically a regional circuit of MMA in Europe and branding it UFC. At that point, what does that brand even mean?
Yeah.
It just means guys fighting, and that's not a brand, guys. I mean, the UFC at one point had this aura, like, oh, this is Ultimate Fighting Championship. This is it. This is the Super Bowl of MMA. This is the big time. And I think they've watered down their own brand, and I'm worried they're going to water it down even more. But
is there anything we did not get to on the talking points list?
We have covered all our talking points, and the only thing left to say is thanks for coming back, Mr. Big Timer. Good to see you again.
Dude, there was one thing that I freaking wanted to talk about, and we didn't. Before we go, hold on. Let me look one thing.
Look at your notes, son. Look at your notes.
God damn it. There was one thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, here's the last thing. This is not what I want to do, but let's just circle back to ratings real quick, and then we'll go. I'll make it fast. One of the things I worry about with the ratings, it's like, which is why I don't understand what Bellator is doing. It's like they pull, an average of 1.1 or 1.2, whatever it was, and then they peaked to the 1.4, which for Bellator is like.
You're talking about Bellator 106 with.
It's like, holy Jesus, that's a good number, especially for them.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't be a great number on Spike, 4 years ago or something. But this is not even UFC, and it's 2013. Like, part of me is like, so with Bellator and UFC, it's like Bellator gets this great number on Spike, which says if you put together a good show, it didn't work out in this particular case except for the main event, but that's just roll of the dice. That you just don't know how fights are going to go. But the best you can do is put together important, fun, relevant fights on paper with guys people know and care about. That's the best thing you can do, and then it's out of your hands. And they did that. And they marketed it, and they gave it away for free, and it worked. And then they say, let's put the third one on pay-per-view. And I've talked about the MMA Beat, why that's just a bad idea, because Bellator is a cognitive paywall. Like, you have to convince people to get around the idea that it's Bellator just to give them a chance. To then say, oh, we're also going to charge you money for this, like, forget about it. But so they had these good ratings, and it's like, why are you in an age of declining ratings for MMA across the board? Why are you abandoning to go to pay-per-view? And the same with the UFC. It's like, on the one hand, I can see why Fox would be happy with them because their numbers on Fox are great, or at least FS1 and FS2 are good. Really, I mean, important for the growth of FS1 and FS2, quite candidly, if not central.
Critical, I would say. They're tentpole programming. They're holding up the tent.
For sure. But as FS1 grows year over year, will the ratings for our UFC stuff continue to grow? Like, are we going to get back to a day where UFC Fight Night 79 is pulling 1.5 mil? I don't know. I really kind of, I don't know. And I don't know what the answer is. But I worry, like, hey, let's take these what would be, relative to what we could pull on, let's say, something else at a different time. Hey, let's take it. These are good partners to us. They'll help us with our international expansion. This is important. Let's take this. Let's contribute to their growing development properties. Get that rights-based model in the next contract or the one after that. And let's just take it. And as those properties grow, we'll grow back with them. Is that a given? I don't know. I worry about that.
I worry about that too, Luke. Well, you wouldn't let me be as gloomy as maybe I wanted to be, but we had a little sunshine in there, and we talked about. I mean, their ambitions are amazingly ambitious. I mean, this is nearly crazy talk ambitious what they're shooting for, and so you got to applaud that, I guess. But a lot of rocky shoals on the way to the top of the mountain. I mean, a lot of rocks in the stream as they climb to the top of the mountain. If I can mangle my metaphors.
I mean, who on this planet? Not even Microsoft, not Apple, not Sony, not. And I'm trying to think of these gigantic companies. Like, which companies are bigger than them?
Nobody I know.
Nobody can conquer Earth. It just
It's never been done.
It's an impossible. This is an impossible fractured planet, man. And trying to find a cohesive vision to bring it all together. Good luck. You're going to need it.
Exactly. Well, thanks very much, Luke. I hope we can have you back sooner next time. And
follow me on Twitter at SBN Luke Thomas.
And read your stuff at MMA Fighting. And where can people listen to you talk on the radio?
Sirius XM Fight Club, Mondays 4 to 6 on XM. It's Sirius XM, I believe 202.
Awesome. Keep looking for that. And adios, MMA aficionados. This is Kid Nate signing out. And remember to subscribe to MMA Nation on YouTube, and you'll get all these suckers before anybody else. We'll see you next time.
Bye, fool.